Welcome to Prevention Institute's Peer Learning Forum on Trauma-Informed Systems within local government and tribal entities, and supporting your community and essential workers during the COVID-19 pandemic and afterward. Before we get started, I want to share a little bit to ground us. The COVID-19 pandemic is a pretty unprecedented experience. It's something we've never dealt with before. Our systems are becoming more fragmented because the pandemic has really exacerbated the existing cracks in our systems. And the communities that were already dealing with trauma before are dealing with it even more now. We're all building this plane as we're flying it. And we're hoping that what we share today will help you all in that journey. We're also adding, next slide. We're also adding a land acknowledgement to our webinar. We often call this out as a necessary part of healing in our work, and we're hoping to model this some more in the work that Prevention Institute continues to do. So we acknowledge that we are located here in the Bay Area on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone, who were the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. As the indigenous stewards of this land and in accordance with their traditions, the Ramaytush Ohlone have never ceded, lost, nor forgotten their responsibilities as the caretakers of this place and for all peoples who reside in their traditional territory. As guests, we recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland, and we wish to pay our respects by acknowledging the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush community and by affirming their sovereign rights as First Peoples. Next slide. This webinar is part of a project supported by a cooperative agreement with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and the views and information provided here do not necessarily represent the official views of the Department of Health and Human Services, the CDC, or Prevention Institute. We're going to encourage folks to use the text chat to join in on the conversation, and we're going to kick that off right now with our first question. So if you could, in the text box, share in a few words, what have you done to build up your resilience or your community's resilience during the pandemic? And please, please answer the questions in the chat box while we go through the next couple of slides, and then we'll kind of loop back around to see what folks are sharing. But please share, what have you done to build up your resilience during the pandemic in the chat box? Next slide. Here we have the objectives for the session today. So we're going to be taking some time today to describe key features of a trauma-informed system and its importance for preventing trauma and suicide during the pandemic. We're going to talk about how our Prevention Institute's Adverse Community Experiences and Resilience framework to think about community-level recovery and systems change supports well-being in the long term. We're going to explore how agencies and organizations within cities and tribal entities are integrating internal and external facing trauma-informed practices. And we're going to discuss opportunities to overcome challenges and apply this information in your own community. Next slide. So for today's session, we'll be getting a little context from Dr. Howard Pinderfuse first, and then we're going to be hearing from speakers from across the US who will share their experiences with trauma-informed systems. Then we're going to break off and have some small group discussions and report backs before we wrap up for the day. Again, we encourage you to share questions and comments in the chat box. We're going to be monitoring that and kind of reporting back on what we see there. We may not be able to answer all of the questions that you have in this hour and a half, but hope that it can really spark some ideas and action for moving forward. I think we always, there's always so much information to share. And I think we might end up being pressed for time, but we're gonna definitely continue to follow up on this conversation. So I'd like to ask Alicia if you can share out some of the themes that we're seeing pop up in the text chat.
Yeah, for sure. Hi, everyone. Seeing lots around kind of self-care and finding ways to find connection with loved ones and friends, connections with youth and trying to think about opportunities for youth, things around like yoga and walking and active listening. There's so many different things that people are doing. So continue to share in the chat and feel free to go and read what others are sharing too.
Great, thanks, Alicia. Next slide. So just to give a little bit of an intro here before I hand it over to Howard. When we talk about trauma, we usually include both adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and adverse community experiences, which are a reflection of the harm that people face as a result of systems, policies, and practices. Things like concentrated poverty, displacement, failing school systems, and things like that. Next slide. So why are we focusing on trauma-informed systems? The types of trauma that we're talking about are really pervasive. We're dealing with COVID-19, loss of jobs, social isolation, racism, and historical trauma as well. And this is really far-reaching, deep and wide. But one of the things that we do know is that healing is possible and that ACEs are preventable, and that there are protective factors like safe and supportive relationships that can help with healing. Next slide. But a lot of the work that we're talking about needing to do here requires systems to take ownership and work together to get us there. And when we're talking about a system, we're talking about things like education, the housing system, the justice system, immigration, all of these kind of systems that operate around us and that are supposed to be there to kind of support us in our work. And since these systems are the ones that have also produced a lot of the inequities and trauma that we see in our communities, these systems themselves must also recognize their tremendous impact, both historical and present day, on the communities that they serve. And this includes a necessary comprehensive approach across multiple systems and a citywide trauma-informed approach to move us forward. Next slide. And this aligns with a lot of the strategies outlined in the CDC suicide prevention and ACEs prevention technical packages. A trauma-informed systems approach in cities requires attending to multiple strategies in a synergistic way. Trauma-informed practices need to be built into each of the strategies. For example, economic supports need to be approached through a lens that looks at the trauma that people have been facing. Suicide care needs to be trauma-informed by also examining and being conscious of the fact that folks that might have attempted suicide have, are dealing with other traumas in their lives, whether it's household trauma, family-related trauma, or being part of a community that's been disinvested. And those approaches need to be trauma-informed and culturally appropriate. And also thinking about trauma-informed systems, those really do fit among some of the strategies in these technical packages, like creating protective environments and looking at organizational policies and culture. So we've shared links to both of these technical packages in the chat box. So now we're going to be moving on to hearing from our panelists today. Next slide. First up, we have Dr. Howard Pinderhughes, Director of the Sociology Doctoral Program at the University of California, San Francisco, and a longtime partner of Prevention Institute. Howard co-developed Prevention Institute's Adverse Community Experiences and Resilience Framework to address and prevent community trauma with the support of Kaiser Permanente Northern California Community Benefit. Welcome, Howard. And we're hoping that today you can tell us a little bit about why a trauma-informed approach is important and kind of within the context of having a systems level approach and why that's important as well. And can you unmute Howard?
How's that?
That's perfect.
Okay. Y'all need to get another picture of me. You next slide.
Were we able to include Howard's slides in here?
If not, that's fine.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, it looks like we can just go on, Howard.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll do it. You want to do it without slides, which is cool.
Yeah, let's do it without slides if we can. We'll make sure to share your slides out when we share out the whole slide deck with folks.
Okay, that's fine.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then you can take the text chat question off the screen.
Let's go back to Howard's photo. Yeah. Go back a few slides.
Right. So
there we go.
Ruben talked a bit about kind of where we're at, and I want to underscore that we're here to talk about trauma-informed systems within the context of a pandemic. But it's COVID-19, but it's we've come to understand as a triple pandemic, with COVID-19 and the trauma that has been incurred by COVID-19, racism, and then the economic recession / depression that has resulted as a result of the impacts of COVID-19 on local economies, national economies, as well as communities. And as a result of that, we've got pervasive trauma that's been incurred, and what we've come to understand as synergistic trauma. It's the combination of several sources of trauma that are part of what we have to address. Now, what we're here to talk about is what systems and government and community-based organizations can do around those issues of trauma. Now, Ruben talked a bit about this concept of community trauma, and I'll talk just a little bit about what that is, and then talk a bit about how we focus on it from a standpoint of a systems perspective. In terms of community trauma, what we've come to understand over the last 10 to 15 years is that trauma is not just an individual phenomenon, although we've really come to really understand the depths of that trauma at an individual level, and come to develop trauma-informed systems and pedagogy as a standard of care for individuals who have trauma. However, what we've come to understand over the last 5 to 7 years is that communities, which normally are the fabric and foundation of resiliency for individuals and communities and families, when faced with trauma, communities themselves can be traumatized. And what that means is that the aspects of communities that provide resilience are traumatized themselves. So the structure of opportunity, the actual built environment, and the social and cultural environment and set of relationships in a community are undermined or destroyed. And within that context, what we need to understand is that this happens as a result of structural violence that happens in part as a result of the ways in which our systems and our organizations function in society. So, for example, we've got the mass incarceration of Black and Brown folks in many communities across the country, which is a function not just of the criminal justice system, but also the educational system and the school to prison pipeline, the social service system, and the way in which it functions in terms of undermining families. All of our systems and all of our institutions, unintentionally often, but have served to produce inequity in terms of health outcomes, inequity in terms of economic outcomes, inequity in terms of environmental outcomes. And that's part of what we're here today to talk about, is how a trauma-informed approach can do a couple of things. One, it's critical that systems acknowledge the damage and harm that they've done historically and present day in terms of exacerbating the conditions in underserved, under-resourced, and highly impacted communities. And this is particularly the situation when we talk about now during COVID-19, where the pandemic has shown us that the disparities and inequities that we've had in our systems have been exacerbated by this pandemic. And clearly the people who are paying the highest price, both in morbidity and mortality, have been poor communities of color across the nation. And what we're talking about is, for example, we saw all of last year with the racial justice movements out in the streets protesting the ways in which criminal justice systems have dealt with Black and brown communities. We understand that part of what needs to take place is that those systems have to be held accountable for the damage they've caused historically. It's important that they be at the table and acknowledge that damage, but it's not enough for acknowledgement. Part of what we need to do is come up with processes, strategies, and systems for promoting healing within the context of communities and individuals. And that's what trauma-informed care and trauma-informed systems, trauma-informed government, and trauma-informed relationships is all about, is figuring out both how to acknowledge the harm, but also to transform systems so that they actually promote well-being and promote health and that's both physical health, mental health, emotional and spiritual health, and economic health on the part of communities and for the families, children and youth, and individuals who make up our communities. So that, I think, is the most important piece, is to understand that we're going to be talking about strategies for transforming the way that systems create wellness versus being agents of structural violence, where they create harm and inflict trauma.
Thank you, Howard. It's always great to hear you talk about this, because you speak of it with such clarity in terms of what we need to recognize. And I think, you know, the questions around what are we talking about when we're talking about trauma-informed work and trauma-informed systems, it's really about recognizing that the systems themselves have inflicted harm on communities in one way or another. And those systems really need to look inward and figure out what they need to do to stop producing that harm and actually start producing healing and resilience in a way. And Prevention Institute, you know, doesn't have all of the answers to all of this. What we can offer is a framework for thinking about it and looking at it. And the answers are going to be different depending on where you are, what system you're working within. And it really is up to that system and those of us in communities who can then push against those systems and advocate with those systems and try to hold those systems accountable, because accountability is a really important part of this.
One thing I certainly will interject into that, Ruben, is a trauma-informed approach is one that sees the solution as a collaborative with community rather than systems that are going to do things for community. Part of healing is being able to bring communities and bring populations into the process of government, of strategy development, of healing, and allow them to be the agents for their own change in their own communities. That's part of the healing process.
That's great. Thank you, Howard, for adding that. So Howard, thanks for helping to frame the discussion here. And we're going to come back to you toward the end of the session to get some more of wrap-up thoughts as well. So thank you, Howard. So we're going to move on to the next slide, and we've got another text chat question for folks to kind of throw some thoughts out there. How has your community taken a trauma-informed approach during the pandemic? So add your thoughts and we'll loop back around to some of the things that we see in the text chat after our next speaker. So next slide. Next up, we have Zeke Cohen, who is a Baltimore City Council member for the 1st District. Zeke has represented the 1st District on the Baltimore City Council since 2016. Zeke was a teacher in West Baltimore, and after getting his master's degree in public policy from Johns Hopkins, he started a nonprofit, The Intersection, to help young people learn community organizing and civic leadership. He ran for office with the belief that democracy only works when everyone has a voice in the process. In July 2019, Zeke introduced the Elijah Cummings Healing City Act, making Baltimore the first city in the country to comprehensively legislate trauma-informed, trauma-responsive care. The bill, which was signed into law in February 2020, and the movement that propelled it forward here were created to help Baltimore heal from enduring legacies of trauma, racism, and violence. So I want to welcome Zeke, and we're excited to hear about how Baltimore has taken a trauma-informed approach, particularly centering the needs of young people. And so I will advance us to the next slide and open it up for Zeke to share.
Thank you so very much. It is truly an honor to be with you and all of these amazing people and to share this space. So like Ruben said, my name is Zeke. I represent District 1 on the City Council. And I came to this work mainly through my experiences as an educator, teaching in 2 schools that lacked heat, air conditioning, or drinkable running water. I taught in neighborhoods that had been redlined and where young people were disproportionately exposed to violence and other ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, largely through the way in which Baltimore has done public policy around white supremacy. We were the first city in the country to enact an ordinance in 1910 that codified racial housing segregation between Black, white, and Jewish folks. We fought and failed the war on drugs that quickly became a war on Black and brown neighborhoods. So many of our institutions in our city have been governed through policies that have hurt, harmed Black and brown communities. And so when we think about trauma in Baltimore, it's really important to keep the context of policymaking in everybody's mind. So fast forward a bit, I'm a city council person. We about 2 years ago, there was a really horrific shooting in a school in West Baltimore. It was broad daylight. A gentleman walked into the building with a gun and shot a member of the school staff. This is while classes were happening. It was incredibly traumatic for the students, the staff, the community. And it was just, even though no one died, imagine having someone walk into your school and shoot someone while you're trying to learn. It was horrific. We held a hearing focused on youth violence and youth voices. So to really try to understand from the young people's perspective what was going on and what we could do to improve safety for our young people. And a lot of the discourse at the time among adults was really centered on whether we should arm school police, the theory being that a good guy with a gun could stop a bad guy with a gun, or whether we should have more metal detectors and sort of harden the targets, as was said, of our schools. The young people who came and testified at our hearing wanted nothing to do with either of those 2 solutions. They were very clear, and specifically a young woman named Jayana, Brianna, and a young man named Damani were very clear that they were not interested in further or more policing, but what they wanted from their city council was prevention. And specifically, they named every ACE, every adverse childhood experience in the book. They talked about the day-to-day experiences of being homeless. They talked about being overly exposed to violence. They talked about what it's like to have family that struggles with substance use and addiction. And they talked about just being Black in a city that was one of the birthplaces of redlining and what that does to your psyche and to your well-being. And they really took us to task and said, look, you spend so much time thinking about, strategizing about our police department and its budget. Why don't you spend a commensurate amount of energy thinking about the traumatic experiences that we endure every single day? And for me as an educator, when young people speak and are so direct and clear, it behooves you to listen. And so after the hearing, went up, followed up with them, and said, look, I think you're absolutely right. Let's try to figure out what a legislative solution, because at the end of the day, I am a legislator. I make public policy for my city. Let's figure out what a legislative solution might look like for Baltimore. And so we spent about a year in deep relationship with the young people, going around from libraries to laundromats to rec centers to classrooms all across the city of Baltimore to try to listen and understand what a public policy solution could look like to decrease trauma in our city. At around the same time, folks on this call will remember that the late, great Congressman Elijah Cummings was leading this work nationally. He was not only prosecuting then President Trump, but he was also holding the first ever congressional hearing on childhood trauma in Washington, D.C., in Congress. And he also called on us in Baltimore. He pulled a group of us together and said to us, look, I'm not going to be here for much longer. He was very sick at the time. We now know, though we didn't know at the time, that he had very serious cancer. He said, I'm not going to be here much longer, but I need you to pick up this ball and carry it forward and figure this out for our city. And as someone who had been sort of a mentor or a mentee of his, again, when you get that kind of a call in, you better take it seriously. And so we went around the city, and as we were listening, what we heard was overwhelmingly to what Dr. Pinderhughes said. Not only did people have ideas, but they wanted to be part of the solution. And they wanted a seat at the table, and they wanted to do it in a way where we're not operating in silos, because I think in Baltimore and in a lot of our cities, we have the education folks over here, we have the nonprofit people. They wanted to do it collectively. And so about a year later, we got together at Morgan State University, which is one of our historically Black colleges. We held a youth healing day. About 350 young people from our city came together to give TED Talks, poetry, panels on healing. And then 2 days later, we went to Coppin State, our other HBCU, and we had a huge resource fair. We had barbers and beauticians who themselves told us, we want to be part of this healing city thing. We're the healers of our communities. And so they were giving out free haircuts. And then we all collectively marched to Frederick Douglass High School, which is where that shooting had taken place. And the young people spoke about the importance of this legislation, and the mayor signed the bill. It was a powerful moment. I'm going to be really quick and say the bill does three things. One, it creates a citywide task force, which we literally swore in 2 days ago. It's got beauticians, pediatricians, educators, returning citizens, students, people from all walks of life coming together to devise a collective strategy to reduce trauma. Number two is it calls for training of every city agency to understand not only the brain science of trauma and healing, but also effective responses. And then number three, it calls on each agency with the task force to review their policies and procedures with a lens toward reducing re-traumatization. Because the thing that we know is that we, city government, have been the perpetrator of so much trauma within our city. And to Dr. Pinderhughes's point, what we know is that no solution is going to work without the voices of our community informing it. So that's what our legislation does. And I'll briefly end by saying the pandemic has exacerbated all of the inequalities, all of the traumatic incidents that already existed. What it's also done, though, is create new opportunities, new relationships, and a new sense of urgency around this work, because it's not just, it's all of us that are feeling this sense of depression, anxiety, loneliness. There's this connectedness that I think has been built, not equally, to be clear, disproportionately in the same communities that were harmed before the pandemic, but I think it has raised the consciousness of the work to be trauma informed. And it's why we're proud to be the first city, and hopefully not the last city, to pass a law to comprehensively deal with trauma informed care. Thank you.
Thank you, Zeke. We really appreciate it. And we shared a link to both the legislation and to the Healing City Baltimore website in the chat. I want to really quickly turn to Alicia and see if there are any themes or comments that have come up in the chat box that we should share with folks before moving on to the next speaker.
Yeah, I think what you shared really resonated with folks. They shared about things like virtual trauma-informed counseling that's happening in certain locales, and really embedding a mental wellness approach when working with schools. Someone mentioned telehealth care for state employees and how the Department of Education is doing a statewide trauma-informed training or trainings with educators. So lots of themes that seem to resonate. And I've been putting some of the summary points that our speakers have been sharing in the chat as well.
Great, thanks, Alicia. So next up, we have Robin Singer from Tarpon Springs, Florida. Robin is the founding director of Peace4 Tarpon, a community initiative which made Tarpon Springs one of the first trauma-informed communities in the nation. She's an artist, an educator, a writer, and a public speaker who founded the organization while serving as Tarpon Springs vice mayor. So welcome, Robin, and we're excited to hear about how Tarpon Springs has become a model for trauma-informed cities also.
Thank you, Ruben, and it's great to be here with everybody. It's a pleasure and an honor. As Ruben mentioned, I was serving as Tarpon Springs vice mayor, but my background was that of an artist. So I came really from a very unusual perspective as far as getting into finding the bridge from being an artist to understanding ACEs and trauma and resilience and so forth. But when I got involved in city government for the first time, I became very aware of service providers, agencies, of all the folks within our county and within our community who are all doing wonderful work to try to transform our community. And after, for example, I went to the homeless leadership. I was on the homeless leadership board for our county. And at my first meeting, they said, we're going to be eliminating homelessness in Pinellas County in 10 years. And I was very naive. And I said, well, that's wonderful. Finally, someone's going to eliminate homelessness. That's great. And then after a while, I didn't see those numbers going down. And I noticed that across the board, that a lot of times folks were doing great work, but I didn't see the results of reduced numbers of domestic violence or child abuse. And started noticing that there was a kind of a disconnect there. So I started wondering what that disconnect was and trying to seek what that missing link was. And that's when I discovered the ACE study, trauma, becoming trauma informed. And it was a huge light bulb that went off for me. And I thought, okay, I get it now. We're not looking at the root cause. We're looking at symptoms. We're putting Band-Aids on symptoms, and we're not seeking the root cause and trying to figure out a way to deal with and address that. It was a huge wake up for me, and I was so inspired that I asked someone to come and present ACEs and to our city council. We had a presentation at the meeting. And at that meeting, you know, of course, you need a certain number of votes for anything to move forward. And I saw light bulbs going off over the heads of some of my fellow commissioners and the mayor. And I said, I think I've got the vote. So I said, you know, I'd like Tarpon Springs to move forward with this and to become a trauma-informed community. And I'd like the city to be the first partner in Tarpon Springs. So the city indeed was our first partner. But I took kind of a traditional path in bringing others to the table. I brought large agencies and our police chief and like the big, if you will, players in the community to the table. And after a while, I noticed that quite often people change positions within their agency, or they may move, or they may, you know, move to a different part of the county. So it wasn't as enduring as I had hoped. Someone could be very invested in doing the work, and then, you know, all of a sudden they'd be somewhere else doing something else. And I thought, well, the community are the folks that are here, and in Tarpon Springs, they're here for generations. We have a lot of multi-generational, you know, people who move away and come back and so forth. So I thought we really need to start including community members in this, in the conversation, but also in finding solutions and see what works for them. So there was a conscious effort to bring community to the table. And that was also a challenge, because at the same time, you might have for example, one of our members that came to, a community member that came to the table was a hairstylist. And she said, I knew her personally. My hairstylist worked at the same salon, and she knew the work that Trauma Informed and Peace4 Tarpon was doing. And she said, you know, Robin, people disclose to me in my chair all the time, and I need to know what to say to them and how to respond. And I said, well, start coming to our meetings and, you know, see what you can do. Sidebar, Peace4 Tarpon, Trauma Informed, Building Resiliency. Everything that we do deals with connection, inform, transformation, and healing. We align everything that comes to us with one of those 4 key principles in this. So with Peggy, who was the hairstylist, it was connecting her to the group. However, she was a little bit reticent because she might be sitting next to a mayor or the director of a large agency, and here she is a hairstylist. So it took months for her to actually find her voice and speak up. But when she did, wow, what a voice. You know, she was an amazing person. She has now a little information kiosk at her Peace4 Tarpon brochures and bumper stickers and everything. So that's just one example of that. Can I see the next slide, please? If we have a next slide. So this is our early marketing piece that we did. And at the bottom, you see we didn't have even a website. We just had a Facebook page. But this was an example of community members coming together to try to figure out how they could put words to the work that we were doing that resonated with people, that wasn't all about trauma this and trauma that and ACEs this and ACEs that. So they discovered phrases that they hoped would resonate with people. And there are a couple of phrases in here that are so powerful and so important. But one of them is that this initiative will inspire to offer what peace we can to help heal the pain of trauma. And that has become our motto, offer the peace you can. So we encourage community members to discover what peace they can offer to the solution and to work with us. And we don't provide direct services, but we will put all our energy behind them to see that their efforts bear fruit and become real and that their vision is realized. There's another thing in here that was really kind of important as well, is that compassion is important and powerful. So as we go through this work, becoming a compassionate community is a natural part of this work as well. So also, you don't have to offer an ultimate solution. Let's build trust. Let's have real conversations. You're not alone. There's nothing wrong with you. We're all in this together. Those types of big messages. So this piece is very, very early, before we had a logo, before we had a website, but it still rings true. And I absolutely love it. And could I see the next slide, please? Thank you. So this is a more recent piece of our marketing. Now, early on, this was in 2010 when Peace4 Tarpon began, we didn't hear the word resilient. It was all about trauma and ACEs. And all of a sudden people said, well, we really should balance that with some resiliency and some things like that. But honestly, resiliency was not part, to my recollection, of the early conversation. So in our marketing team, in other words, and again, not professional marketers, but folks who, one of them is an artist, one of them is a, just a self-educated trauma person, just whoever they are. One of the folks said, we really need a symbol for us as a resilient community. And she's done quite a bit of work in nature and so forth. And she said, we have the most shoreline of any city in Pinellas County. And we have red mangroves all over our city. And she said, the red mangrove is an amazing tree. It takes toxic salt water and transforms it in its root system into fresh water. It's a nursery system for all Gulf life. The more healthy your mangroves are, the more Gulf life comes closer to shore. So whether sport fishermen, commercial fishermen can fish further in. We have a large sponge industry. We're a working waterfront, so that also creates resilience and opportunities economically for our community. But it seemed to be a perfect metaphor for transforming through the power of community, through our roots, the toxic experiences that most of us or all of us experience into fresh water as we grow and as we learn and as we transform. So one of our members of the marketing team created this image for us, and we thought, this is a great symbol of us as a resilient community. And someone else said, I wonder if we have a city tree. Well, we didn't have a city tree. So we presented this artwork to the city commission, and now the official city tree of Tarpon Springs is the red mangrove. So we're trying to kind of blur those barriers between city government and community members and have a common vision of how we all work together and how we're all a part of this system together. So this is our symbol of resilience. Now, when COVID happened, we had been having meetings at City Hall. By the way, we're an unfunded initiative. We're unfunded, so we're run on volunteer energy, basically, and goodwill. But we also don't compete with other agencies for grant dollars. We're not scrambling. We don't have golf tournaments and galas and things like that. We think that there's enough money being spent on trauma and trauma responses that if we could just find a way to spend it differently, that's more meaningful, perhaps, that it's not a matter of finding more money. It's a matter of using this money more wisely. One thought. And so we had the whole city basically open to us as far as we can have meetings. We work with our library, from early learning, the education system, from the Early Learning Coalition, elementary, middle school, high school, all the way up into upper level education. We work with, of course, the agencies, the Housing Authority, but we wanted to bring services to Tarpon Springs. We're an overlooked community sometimes, or we were, and we wanted to bring services to our community members. So if someone wishes to address their trauma, now we have counseling services available at no charge for family members and individuals in one of our neighborhoods where there's an after-school program. And so if someone in the after-school program, a teacher or counselor, sees a child is struggling, they can walk next door. And the Housing Authority has an apartment complex there. The Housing Authority partnered with us and gave up 3 of their units there and allowed free office space to a large mental health provider to come in and have free office space, because the mental health provider, it's not that they didn't want to be here and provide services, they just didn't have it in their budget to provide office space. So it's finding these kind of creative solutions to bring services, anger management classes. No one has to take a day off work and ride a bus to South County to go to court mandated classes. The Pinellas Ex-Offender Reentry Coalition brought anger management courses, classes here for folks. So we try to be responsive. If someone has a creative idea or an idea that's emerging in our community, we get behind that and we find a way to support it and help it to emerge. If we see something that's missing, we see if we can't find a way to bring that to ourselves. So we were meeting in City Hall before the pandemic. And then when the pandemic happened, everything shut down. There were no Peace4 Tarpon meetings for several months while we regrouped and kind of as everyone was getting over the shock of it and so forth. So then once again, we started up again with our Zoom meetings, and we had our first meeting of the year, and we asked the community, what would you like us to work on? We're here at your service. What can we do to make Tarpon more connected, to inform folks? How can we work with you? And one of our community partners, who's also on our board of directors actually, represents the Baha'i community, and the Baha'i community is very interested in community building. And he said, I would like us to have a community tea, a Zoom tea, not for any other reason other than just to get people together, to build relationships, to talk to one another. So we had a couple of planning meetings, and someone on the planning meeting found a list of virtues. And she said there are like 100 or so virtues. And she said, let's have different leaders each time discuss one of these virtues, and we'll all just discuss it and get to know each other and so forth. So the first virtue that was picked was compassion. So there was a wonderful meeting, a community tea with the theme of compassion. The next one was forgiveness. And we're just about to have our third one. We have them once a month, so we don't know what the topic will be. But the unintended consequence of this was to bring folks who were homebound. There were elderly folks who had not been able to get vaccines. This was pre-vaccine, actually, who were isolated, lonely. So social-minded people who were isolated needed a place to be. They needed a place to connect. So this was one way that they were able to do that. It also brought in the disability community. So folks who might, one of our folks has MS and is in a chair. She's not able to travel or get out much, but she can participate in these meetings very easily. Conversely, this also, turning everything over to Zoom, put some people out of the picture, because if you don't have good computer skills or computer connections, or you don't have the wherewithal to do this or whatever. So it brought new people to us, and some people receded to the background. But for us, it's not a matter of how many meetings you go to, or big commitments, because people have lives. We all are busy people with a lot of things to do. So once someone understands trauma and resilience and so forth, it helps us to, I guess we're moving on. I tend to go on a bit, so let me wrap it up here. So there are other communities that are following the Peace4 model. There's Peace4 Crawford County, Pennsylvania, Peace4 Gainesville, Peace4 the Big Bend, which is a 10-county region up in the Panhandle, Peace4 Minnesota, which is 3 counties south of St. Petersburg. So we're seeing these coalitions forming. But what's most encouraging is that each one has a very different form, a different type of energy. And we also work with communities all around the United States, no matter what their form is, to help bring this knowledge and understanding forward. And with that, I will just say, I appreciate once again being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin, for sharing that experience and really lifting up the theme of connection and compassion. I think are both really key to approaching trauma, especially right now. We're going to move on to our next dynamic duo of speakers. But before we do that, we'll put another chat box question up. Who are some of the partners in your locale that you're working with to promote a trauma-informed approach? So both Zeke and Robin gave us some really good examples of some of the work that they've been doing with different partners. Who have you been working with? Please let us know in the chat box. And I'm going to queue up our next two speakers, Dr. Ken Epstein and Luis Arroche from San Francisco. Ken is with Prep for Change Consulting, which helps organizations promote and achieve culture change by improving organizational practices and workforce development. He's also a leadership coach for Trauma Transformed. In 2018, he retired from the San Francisco Department of Public Health as the County Children, Youth, and Families Behavioral Health Director. And in this capacity, he developed and led the vision and implementation of trauma-informed systems, which has become an organizational promising practice. Luis is a native San Franciscan and first-generation Latino who understands the importance of addressing systemic racism and its impact on communities of color. He's the project manager for the Our Children, Our Families Mental Health Initiative, or HEAL SF, that focuses on aligning resources and strategies that support and cultivate mental well-being for all those who live and or work in San Francisco. I am really excited to have both of these gentlemen share a little bit about the work that they've done in San Francisco, and especially how that work is extending out to supporting city staff and essential workers. Gentlemen, I will hand it over to you all, and we can move to the next slide.
Sorry about that. The mute button, always miss the mute button. So I want to take the time to thank everyone. I know that we get into this process of trying to share a lot of great information to a large audience, and we don't take the moment to kind of breathe a second and just understand that we received a lot of wealth of information. And also I'm asking you to open your heart and open your mind a little bit as I share with you the importance and why it's important to be supporting our workforce. My 9th grade teacher saved my life. My home was right in the middle of a gang war zone. My neighborhood park was right in the middle of a gang war zone. My high school was right in the middle of a gang war zone. My 9th grade teacher saved my life. I remember walking into class on my first day of school. My body was filled with adrenaline, making me hypersensitive to my surroundings. My stomach growled from hunger, and my face frowned, sending the message to all, I am not the one to mess with. My 9th grade teacher saved my life. Miss Miranda was her name. Miss Miranda was my history teacher. Miss Miranda reminded me of a fairy tale godmother. She was kind, soft-spoken, and always present. She was always presente. My mom wasn't in the best shape. She drank a lot and would hit me when she got drunk. My 9th grade teacher saved my life. Every morning I would walk into school, throwing up gang signs, causing trouble, not listening. Miss Miranda every morning would ask me if I'd eaten breakfast and would accompany me to the kitchen to get a bowl of cereal. I felt safe with her. I felt that she cared and saw my wounds. Miss Miranda was always present. Unfortunately, I would drop out of high school and spend most of my teenage years in juvenile detention centers across the state of California. I wrote to Miss Miranda from my detention centers, but eventually we lost touch, and I lost touch with her. But her kind words, her consejos, guided me through some of the most darkest moments in my life. Years later, I ran into Miss Miranda, and I asked her, why did she care so much? Her response was perfect. You are not easy. You are mad at the world. And I knew that I needed to be 100% present when you walked into school. Luis, you are a handful, but you deserve my attention. My mind, my emotions, my heart needed to be strong for you. Because with all that rage that you carry, I knew deep inside you were fragile and hurting. Luis, you needed me to be there for you. My 9th grade teacher saved my life. And I am complete. And I will pass it to Dr. Ken Epstein.
Next slide, please. Luis. And to Ruben, if we're the dynamic duo, Luis is definitely Batman. I'm happy to be Robin. How do I follow up, Luis, your words? I just want to pause for a second and thank you for your honesty. And this is why the work works, because you know, when we talk about adversity, there's this pattern now about talking about adversity being ubiquitous. We all have adversity. ACEs, it affects everybody's health, rich and poor, white and black, and all around. And there's this tendency now to generalize it. But the truth is, my adversity is not Luis's adversity. I did not grow up as a white man with much privilege. Um, my experience has been very different. It doesn't disqualify what I'm saying, but it certainly means that you need to look at what I'm saying with bias and understand that I come with the bias of my experience, and also the fact that I've been promoted and moved through the systems in ways that Black and brown people have not been promoted and moved through the system. So it may be the same storm, but it is definitely different boats. And that will be one of the themes of what we want to talk to you about today. Next slide. Next. So you've been hearing early on, there was a question in chat about what is trauma informed. We'll probably all have different definitions, but I think you heard Howard and Ruben, Dr. Pindayus and Ruben and Zeke and Robin, and now Luis talk about trauma informed. What's trauma? What's being trauma informed? It's humanity. It's humanity. You want to make it simple? It's humanity. What we want to talk to you a little bit is about translating this to organizations. Now, I grew up in organizations. I'm a social worker. I'm a middle generation of social workers. My daughter is proudly a social worker. My mom finally retired at 86. When I started at Department of Public Health, I had a very visionary leader named Barbara Garcia. And she asked me why I would start in my 50s to be the director at in an organization in DPH. And I told her, and I'm going to make it short because we have just a bit of time, but it's a bit of the story you've been hearing, that I've been a social worker working in the field, a clinician working in the field for many, many years, that there'd been lots of advances, and I won't go through all of them during my time, but there'd been lots of advances and changes. And yet in the city of San Francisco, the children, the Black and brown children, and the disparities between the Black and brown children and the white children in terms of their health outcomes was despicable, horrible, unacceptable, and they had gotten worse, not better. We had all this evidence and everybody was touting evidence-based practices, and yet our systems were failing worse, not better. How do we understand that? Well, you've heard our speakers talk from policy and community and inclusion and lived experience. I want to give you an organizational lens of that. From an organizational lens, our organizations, as Zeke said, induce trauma. So you see symptoms in our organizations. As opposed to saying what's wrong with our organizations, you might ask what's happened to them. You see symptoms like being reactive. We relive and retell. We're fragmented. We compete for limited amounts of money. We even compete in trauma Olympics to figure out who can get the trauma money as opposed to someone else, or who can define the assessment better than somebody else. Trauma in itself becomes a competition within this capitalist way of thinking about humanity. So you begin to see symptoms, inequity, authoritarian leadership. So what's trauma informed? Well, trauma informed to us, and those symptoms, let me just say, I see it in the system and the ways we impact. And our community, before I go to trauma informed, our community is embedded in our organization. It's not different. They work for our organization. And in our very organization, Black and brown people are not promoted at the rates that other folks are promoted. They are also disciplined more. So our very organization represents the same things that happen in the community. So I said to her that our organization was traumatized. She said we should train the organization. What we did is we went to people like Robin sitting here in 2012 and said, what the hell do you do? And across the country, and we stole shamelessly from anybody we could with permission. And we developed what we thought was a trauma-informed curriculum. And being trauma-informed is just a railway station. It's about training people. It's about awareness. But it is actually not where we need to head. Where we need to head is to be a healing organization. So trauma-informed is shared language. A healing organization is one that makes reflection, makes meaning out of the past. It's growth and prevention orienting. And most importantly, you can measure that it stops inducing trauma in its staff and in its organization and in its community, and it begins reducing trauma. And we have more, Luis, Miss Miranda's, that Miss Miranda is not out of the ordinary, but everybody is in the ordinary. My wife was a librarian. She retired, but I used to say that she was the real social worker because the community walked into her branch library. If she gave them my card, if we weren't married, I gave them my card and said, go see this clinician, there's a 20% chance at best that somebody would walk into my office. So it is not about referring to behavioral health and getting people to go see behavioral health, even though that's what I do. It is about all of us understanding that we can be human and that trauma happens in the context of relationships and it can be healed in the context of relationships. And that's organizationally as well. Next slide. So 3 key concepts we wanted to just talk. If you want to measure something, the organizations I come from, they like to measure productivity and efficiency. By the way, words that don't come from the healing professions, they come from making widgets or Toyotas or something, but they actually, I don't think there's any part of productivity and efficiency that has anything to do with healing. And in fact, you can measure other things. You can measure connection, because connection, by the way, for those of you in the business, is actually billable. We don't have to call it productivity. And you can measure how well your organization connects with each other, and you can do small things every day to connect better. This is the core of being human and being healing. We could make coherence, because trauma, the core of trauma is chaos. It creates chaos in our minds and our systems. It breaks us, it creates silos. So we need to create coherence, and coherence is about coherent communication and having very difficult conversations, even if those difficult conversations are about race and racism, because there is no trauma-informed without racial justice. And the third thing is collaboration. The third thing, and you've heard plenty about that. I don't need to say more, but that's about inclusion, not exclusion. That's about everybody having a voice at the table, and all of our speakers have talked about that as being the key. So the 3 C's of trauma-informed for me are connection, coherence, and collaboration. And that's the antidote to trauma. Next slide. So we wanted to talk a little bit from the policy perspective. So where did we take this? As we developed this in the department, we trained 9,000 people. Trauma Transformed then was initiated through a grant and has now replicated across the country. We now have organizational culture change. We can talk more about that later, and there'll be a link about that work in your chat. The city of San Francisco passed an initiative called Our Children, Our Families. And under Luis's leadership, we came up with 5 ways in which we thought all of our workforce should be trained. And you can see these 5 initiatives: a healthy city, a healing city, a pathway city, an aligned city, and a welcoming city. And the idea around this was just like Zeke is talking about in Baltimore and Robin talked about in Tarpon. This was our way of saying, imagine a workforce from librarian to muni bus driver, to teachers, to everybody in the city. You know, if you're a muni bus driver and a young man walks on your bus, could have been 9th grade Luis, if that was, and you're not going to school, that bus driver could, like Miss Miranda, say something to you that had meaning. If you're a librarian, so that our city workforce all together could and would be trained and understand how we don't just walk by without greeting our homeless, our folks that are experiencing homelessness, that we know how to speak. And so this was a way of thinking about how we as a city could train our workforce. And then came COVID. We were well on our way to building this system, and then came COVID. And so next slide. Luis.
So like, you know, and I come into this role as being someone who was a client, a youth participant, someone that had the lived experience around public systems and where they failed and where they succeeded. And as we started developing this healing city to really take it across the city and really transform our workforce to have more this humanitarian, more this connection to the community, you know, even to the most nuanced things of saying hello to people who are on the street, teachers understanding how to deal with their own implicit bias, teachers to understand how to deal with children dealing with the impact of trauma. We got hit by COVID and our work pivoted, but it pivoted in a very unique way. We actually got the full support of our mayor, Mayor London Breed, to activate what is called HEAL-SF. So from Healing City, we moved into HEAL-SF, and her request was that we create a panel of experts across the city, breaking silos, entering different institutions, bringing those those thought minds, those experts together and really talking about across the city, what is working, what is not working, what are you doing in your organization that is addressing the problem, and let's share those best practices. Let's align our efforts to create a healthier San Francisco, because we will come back to San Francisco. We will enter a recovery phase. And she is very clear that there is no vaccine for mental health. There is not a one pill, there is not a one shot that's gonna deal with what we saw during shelter in place, what our families dealt with while they were away from one another, and what our fellow co-workers and employees have dealt with. We are clear that there's many people in our workforce that are homeless. There's many people in our workforce that are struggling every day, kind of dealing with the pandemic. And so from this activation, QSF came together and created a logistics team that is composed of Kaiser, UCSF, the VA, community nonprofits, city officials, city departments, all coming together to really coordinate an effort to really address the prolonged impact of COVID-19 on our essential workers and our frontline workers. And I want to make the difference because there's a different definition. Essential means important, undisposable, and then you fit a specific tier. Then you have frontline workers who are food distributors, are out on the front line, are case managers. So we understand that there's a tier system already coming into place in this capitalistic view of trauma, like what Dr. Ken Epstein shared. And so we're attempting to break that silo. There is no essential, there's no frontline workers definition. We are all in this together. Next slide. And so we wanted to make sure that we understood the dynamic of what we're dealing with as a workforce. And through this collective grief lens. So we are above 450K plus of related deaths due to COVID-19 in the US. That means our fellow co-workers have lost family members, our family members have lost loved ones. It's a collective grief that we're dealing with. Working remotely hasn't been easy. Dealing with this whole internet, Zoom fatigue, not connecting to our loved ones, being deployed to frontline station has not been easy. The financial stress is high. Am I working enough? Am I doing enough? Is my boss happy with me? What's going to happen once I come back to work? Now that we're working in Zoom, am I going to be laid off? Do they not need me anymore? The financial stress is real for our staff in our workforce. And finally, to deal with the multiple losses and griefs in a short period of time will possess a unique challenge for all of us. What have we dealt with? We have never dealt with this pandemic. Like Ruben said, we are building the plane as it flies. And this is going to present to us a very unique challenge. Next slide. I believe in hearing from lived experiences. I think we need to hear from those who are being impacted the most. And these are a few sample employee comments that we heard. We're being forced into this world's largest work from home experiment. And so far it hasn't been easy. I had another coworker share with me, Luis, my daughter, when she's napping, I'm able to work maybe 48 minutes to 3 hours on my project. It depends if she's sleeping. That means during the day, I'm taking care of her, and at night, I'm being an employee. I'm working 24 hours a day. I am burnt out. Another coworker shared, I am afraid of returning back to work. I don't know how is it gonna be. One comment really broke my heart. I haven't seen my mother, Luis, and it hurts. I haven't seen my mom. I haven't seen my dad, and I'm devastated. And finally, I don't know what I am. Am I essential? Am I frontline? Does anybody care? Final slide, please. And so we in USF, we understand that we have to, one, educate leadership, educate them to understand how do you create a welcoming environment? How do you put policies into place that's really going to set up a conversation where folks can share their frustrations, their fears without being punished, without being punitive. We're also educating, we're also kind of transforming our organizations and our leadership, and we're streamlining information across the city. through digital platforms, through Zoom conferences, through our HEOSF website. And then finally, we are working directly with community. And so we're doing a lot of needs assessment in the community that's really related to COVID-19. We're creating guides and tip sheets for leaders. We have to be realistic that there's a lot of leaders and executive managers that were not trained in trauma-informed practices. And so we're going to provide them the tools to how to understand what it means to be trauma-informed, how to implement trauma-informed policies in your workplace. We're going to give you the tools so you can implement this carefully. And I am complete, and I will pass that back to Ken.
Next slide. I think we're done. I would love to end with Louise's words rather than mine. And just know that all of this is on our website. On the website, on the HEAL-SF website, we have all sorts of resources, webinars, and some of the scripts we've developed. But thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, and I wanted just to be able to end quickly, Ruben, just with the thought and the comment is that, you know, one of the wellness domains for ACE is connecting our youth to caring adults. That is one of the wellness domains. If we do not have that caring adult in place, where will our young people go? We need to take care of the Ms. Mirandas. We need to take care of our mentors in our community. We need to take care of our basketball coaches, of our softball coaches, of our case managers, because when we come back into this whole COVID pandemic, our workforce is going to be impacted by the need of our community. And if our workforce is not ready, we're going to be trying to reinvent the wheel at the same time addressing the mental health needs of our workforce. So this is what is our core belief in HEOSF.
Luis and Ken, thank you so much for all of that. Very inspiring. And Luis, thank you for sharing your personal story as well. I think it really resonated with lots of folks. I know it resonated with me. So thank you for that. We are running a little bit shorter on time than we anticipated. I probably am, like you all, always enthralled by hearing our speakers, and my expert timekeeping goes out the window when I'm hearing from great folks. We do still want to give us a little bit of time. So maybe for the next 10 minutes or so, we're going to break out into some small groups so that you all have a chance to talk to each other. We're going to have a facilitator in each of the groups who's going to help guide us along questions, but really just an opportunity to discuss what you've heard today from folks. We've got a link to a Jamboard. If folks have used it before, the facilitators will know how to use it so that you can kind of document some of your thoughts that we can continue to share out with you all, and so that we can have kind of your feedback as well. So we're going to go ahead and break out into groups for about 10 minutes, and then we'll come back together as a full group to just kind of debrief and close out. So I'm going to ask Cami to split us up now, and we will see you all in about 10 minutes. Welcome back, everybody. And we've got just a minute or so to kind of wrap up our webinar today. Hope everybody had a really good discussion in your small groups. We are really glad to see a lot of the discussion that took place. I was flipping through the Jamboard as I was taking my notes and saw there was a lot of really good comments going on there as well. As we kind of get ready to wrap up, I want to ask Howard if he wouldn't mind just giving us a little bit of his thoughts on what we kind of heard from everybody today, as we get ready to wrap up. And just share with us a little bit of like your.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. My thoughts revolve around the importance of communities being involved in the solution, and that's really at the core of I think, all that we've heard today, that yes, folks are traumatized, but centering on resilience and assets and solutions is the really the basic foundation for healing. And the one thing that I'll say is that this has to be done through a lens of health equity and racial equity, and that understanding that has to be a driver. It doesn't work. One of the things that we've learned over the last 12 months, and I think Ken alluded to it, is we're not all in the same position. We're not all impacted the same way. There was a narrative that got rolled out early on with the pandemic, that the pandemic was the great equalizer. You remember that one, right? Well, we've come to understand that is so not the case. The pandemic is the great exacerbator of structural violence and racism. And that what each of you are hopefully are in systems, organizations, and institutions that are positioned to make a choice of whether or not you are going to be an agent for change and healing, reconciliation, and justice, or continued violence and trauma. And that's really kind of the choice that we're at. And one of the things that I'll say is that over the last 10 months, we've had folks in systems and in governments witness the movements for racial justice that have emerged across the country and proclaimed the need for transformational change and systems change. There's been a lot of proclamations and a lot of promises, and folks are looking around now and saying, what the hell we gonna do? And that's where we're at, is to figure out what the hell we're gonna do. And the first thing we're gonna do is make sure that our communities are at the table and are part of crafting and developing the solution, and that they have real power in the process moving forward.
Howard, thanks for closing us out with that. There's a lot of wisdom in what you shared and what everybody else shared today. We are going to be sending out these slides to everybody, as well as a recording of the webinar. We've got some resources that we've collected, not only through the speakers, but also some additional sources, which are going to be on the rest of these slides as well, including links to the CDC suicide technical package and the ACEs prevention technical package, links to the organizations that spoke today, links to the legislation from Baltimore, links to the work of Trauma Transformed and the San Francisco Department of Public Health and HEAL SF, our Adverse Community Experiences and Resilience Framework. So we're zooming through this because I know we're over time already. You will get all of these links in the slides that we're going to be sending out to you all. We're probably also going to take what we've learned today in the session and turn it into some sort of a written document. So we're going to be sharing that out with folks. We want this conversation to continue. Please feel free to reach out to us with any questions, any feedback. And we are grateful to all of our speakers today and grateful for all of you all to be such active participants, both in your small groups and in the chat box. Thank you all so much for being a part of this, and we will be in touch soon.